Good evening and welcome to Gaming Ballistics Firing Squad. I have the pleasure to be talking with Ken Hite, the prolific writer of many books, including Night's Black Agents and GURPS Horror, which we'll be talking about tonight, as well as the imagination-inspiring Day After Ragnarok, which I will admit that I have not read in any great detail, but it was so cool. And Leonard Balsera, when I talked to him, mentioned it, and I wanted to ask you about it eventually. But just to get going, I wanted to welcome you and thank you for joining me on the interview. And really start off the question with Trail of Cthulhu. That's a game in Cthulhu mythos featuring the gumshoe system. I played it briefly. But before I get into the mechanics, seems like you have long been a fan of the Cthulhu mythos. What draws you to it and inspires you about it, and wanted you to write a fairly complete role-playing book about it?
Well, I mean, first of all, thanks for having me on the Gaming Ballistic vidcast or whatever you call it, Doug. I appreciate the invitation. As far as the Cthulhu mythos, I think there's sort of a combination of things that I enjoy about it. The first is that it is, it's everything that I enjoy, and it's all in one pile. It's secret history, it's conspiracy theory, it's magic, it's occultism, it's horror, it's philosophy, it's hard science fiction, and then it's all just piled up into one place, right? So that just is it's a powerful body of concepts to tool around in. Also, of course, it expands across all time and space, which is handy if you're trying to tell stories. And its exponent was probably one of the 2 or 3 most influential creators of pop culture in the 20th century, and certainly probably the second greatest horror writer in American history. So just the sheer quality of material, at least at the top end of it, it beats any other fictional universe that you want to name. I don't think that anyone else is out there trying to expand Yaknut to Pawpaw County or something, although I'm prepared to be wrong on that. But I don't, there's not a lot of Hamlet fanfic, is what I'm trying to say. The Shakespeare verse is fairly, hived off, whereas the Cthulhu mythos is part of our nerd universe and is growing ever greater. So I guess those are the sort of, reasons to go after it on that level. And then why Trail of Cthulhu? Well, it was just the moment at which Simon got the license for Call of Cthulhu from Chaosium. He thought, well, I'd like to get a known Cthulhu guy to do my game, and asked me to do it. And of course, I'm a freelance writer, and Simon is a tremendously, well, he's a good publisher, but he's also, got a reputation for, probity and treating writers right and doing a good job with a book and producing a proper book with good illustrations when he's supposed to. So for all those other reasons, anyone in their right mind would have signed on to do a game for Simon, certainly.
Yeah, no, I will definitely admit that the book itself is wonderful to read, and that is one thing that I've enjoyed both on Trail of Cthulhu and Night's Black Agents, is that the books themselves make great reading, which is always fun.
That's sort of my job as a writer, is to make sure people want to read the thing. It doesn't matter how good your game design is or how good your ideas are if no one wants to read them. So that's sort of step one, is write prose that people want to keep reading.
No, and that's a great point. I think that's one thing that I've been dinged for a little bit on the grappling book that I wrote for GURPS, is it's dry. It is 50 pages of rules from front to back.
Well, I mean, in fairness, once you've opened a book called GURPS Technical Grappling, you should know the line of country that you've entered, right? It's not like, oh my God, where's the love interest? It's like, no, it's pretty much all going to be +2 to grab the neck. That's right. What it's going to be for 50 pages.
Right, and if you're looking for a love interest in that concept, well, there is grappling involved, but
yes,
this is a family show.
Again, the rules have not been written, thank God.
Indeed. You know what? Even if they have been, my brain will not wrap around that. 2 things actually. You mentioned both. You got your Cthulhu mythos and then Shakespeare, and I think one of the interesting things, of course, Shakespeare tells great stories. But there's a beginning, a middle, and an end to the story, which the nice thing about Cthulhu is it's sort of beyond time and space, and including the Venn diagram is both expansive and non-Euclidean. And it's spun off some really interesting tales. Hellboy is sort of effectively a Cthulhu tale, or at least the movie borrowed significantly from what seemed to me to be the old tentacle horror imagery.
Well, certainly. I mean, when you look at the way that Mignola draws, some of the Ogdru Jahad and some of the other Hellboy beasties, and Mignola's made no, bones about the fact that he's a huge Lovecraft fan and thinks Lovecraft is vitally important. And part of it is just that, one of the things that Lovecraft did is he made the tentacle the signifier of horror in a way that it wasn't before he wrote, right? If you look at people who are writing horror before him, the signifier for otherworldly horror or horror from outside our conventional space was a hoof, right? I mean, even as recently as William Hope Hodgson, his horrors were porcine, they were pigs. And that, of course, is the callback to the good old, imagery of the devil, that he's an animalistic creature with hooves, whether they be pig hooves or deer hooves or whatever kind of, but they aren't, tentacles. Tentacles come pretty much, the only guy who's writing before Lovecraft that does that same thing, M.R. James does it a little bit in Count Magnus, but he doesn't do it as, consistently, I guess, as Lovecraft does. James's horrors are all over the map, whereas Lovecraft is really hitting that, terror of the seafood imagery.
I mean, do you think he was allergic to shellfish or something? Do you know what
he
brought that
definitely
about?
believed that he was allergic to fish. Whether he was or he wasn't, obviously, at that level of psychosomatic problem, he's not fond of seafood, and he had a very strong physical reaction to smelling it. And when you live in a seaport town the way that he did, he must have been sort of confronted with that frailty or that danger every time he walked outside, possibly.
And it's interesting because a rap that I've heard on Peter Jackson's Hobbit and Lord of the Rings is, okay, we get that you're afraid of falling, can we have some other challenge? And yet Lovecraft, of course, being Lovecraft, managed to take that and do it in a lot of ways, and it's always scary, whereas, at least the visuals seem to, for the Hobbit stuff, get a little bit over the top and intense without necessarily inspiring the same fear that they must inspire in Mr. Jackson.
Well, I mean, if anyone had ever died from falling, then it might have inspired the fear. But when the dwarves are falling, 80 stories and bouncing, then it's hard to maintain any tension in a scene. I mean, we've now established in canon, apparently, that the only thing that can die from falling in Middle-earth is the Balrog, which seems odd, but, what do I know? And
even that didn't kill him. It's standard, sword to the chest kind of did it, which mostly does it for most things.
It's a widespread weakness.
I'm going to turn briefly to a couple of questions on the mechanics. Now, did you write the game mechanics to Trail of Cthulhu as
the game mechanics are from Robin Laws's Gumshoe engine. So Robin's Gumshoe system debuted in Esoterrorists, and I adapted Esoterrorists and Fear Itself, which had come out by then, to Trail of Cthulhu. So sort of trying to really recreate as much as I could Sandy Peterson's original Zeroth edition of Call of Cthulhu, and that became what I call the purist mode in Trail, and then the slightly more run-and-gun, Chaosium, Indiana Jones, Robert E. Howard style mode of Call of Cthulhu is what I call the pulp mode. So the book contains sort of two sets of dials that you can use to tune your game for exactly what you want to do with it.
Yeah, I remember back in high school, that was 1987 and 88, I think. Ran Call of Cthulhu back then, and we played effectively in both modes because we played a game that was sort of pulp mode, and we went insane, and I had to kill a fellow character because he was going nuts, and I froze him and crushed him and watched him thaw and went gibberingly insane after that, and that was good fun. But then we also played, I think it was called Cthulhu 20th Century or
Cthulhu Now was the name of the
Cthulhu
book.
Now, that's right. And it was basically, the interesting thing was, and I think we'll get into this a little bit with Knights Black Agents, is you give people a machine gun that works, and all of a sudden horror is a little less scary.
Well, it depends on the horror. Right?
It does.
I mean, you can have all the machine guns that work you want in something like, say, Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hell House, and it's going to be even scarier because now there's mentally disturbed people with machine guns.
Oh, on the they're shooting at you. Yeah. So that works too. So, and I guess the two questions that I sort of had is one sort of mechanics, and if this is like, yeah, that's not my mechanic, whatever, that's cool. But I love the concept of the investigative skills. I think of anything that I'm gonna walk away from Gumshoe, That's the one, because it's not the clues, it's what you do with them. Makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, I mean that's the sort of the core insight of Gumshoe is that one, splitting things into uh, skills in which failure makes the game boring and skills in which failure makes the game interesting. And if the only chance you have for failure is the second half, then you've already made your game 50% less boring, which is a victory.
Agreed.
Yeah.
The thing that struck me, and again, I'm not a rules expert in terms of Gumshoe, but it's at least I think the way that the general skills work. If I'm a doctor and I've got Nice Black Agents, it's medic. Although I think actually the resolution mechanic in Nice Black Agents seems slightly different to me than Trail of Cthulhu. So if I had 8 points or whatever in medic, once I spent them, I was kind of 50-50 on anything that I'd want to try for that adventure. Or is that a misinterpretation of how it works?
Well, medic is a special case because there's a special iteration of it in which you spend points of medic to heal people's injuries as a first aid type ability.
Was first aid so medic was in Nice Black Agents. Was medic also in Trail of Cthulhu?
Yeah, first aid is in Trail of Cthulhu. But the difference is that between Trail of Cthulhu and Night's Black Agents, we'd gotten feedback from people who said, we really hate not being able to heal people anymore. And so that's why if you look in Night's Black Agents, you can still heal once you've gone down to 0. It's just less effective.
Right.
But the general notion is that of a more normal general skill, like say shooting, if you spend points on a roll, you have a better chance of success, right?
Right.
And that's true across both. The difference being that in Call of Cthulhu, if you have 75% pistol, you always have that same 75%, which means you always have a 25% chance of failing your shot, right?
Right.
But if you have in Gumshoe, you have 8 shooting points. Like you say, you begin with usually, depending on what you're shooting at, a 50-50 chance of hitting, because most things have a target number of 4 on a die 6. So if you spend 3 points of your 8, you're guaranteed a hit. And then if you spend 1 point, you've got a much better chance than if you spend no points. But if you spend no points, you're still, as you say, at 50-50. So what's happening in Gumshoe is it's rewarding narrative decision. You figure out when you really want to get that hit and when you don't. And so, whereas in a Call of Cthulhu game, you might wind up hitting the exact same number of times, but they're randomized. In Gumshoe, you've picked where you're going to shoot, and that follows the sort of the narrative first model of Gumshoe, whereas Call of Cthulhu has a strong simulationist quality that comes out of, I guess, Steve Perrin's reaction against D&D ultimately, because it comes out of RuneQuest.
Yeah, fair enough. And I think that when I was playing Trail of Cthulhu with the Gumshoe system, the thing that struck me just in general about that particular general skills mechanic, and nothing that I'm going to say applies to the investigative skills mechanic, which I understand, I agree with, and I love.
Okay.
But the general skills stuff, it's like, if you're a great doctor or whatever. Okay, let's forget the doctor because was a special case. In Nice Black Agents, and maybe it's there and I just glossed over it in Trail of Cthulhu, Nice Black Agents had very clear refresh rules. So if you chill out in a safe house for 24 hours of game time, you can be an awesome shooter again.
Yeah, Trail has similar refresh rules, but it has less opportunity to refresh than Night's Black Agents, because in Night's Black Agents you're playing Jason Bourne.
Right. So you're
that's sort
awesome.
of your default guy. You have to be really awesome. So one of the goals in Night's Black Agents is to feed that economy of general ability points, giving you lots of ways to get them back and lots of opportunities. Whereas in Trail, you're not. You're Randolph Carter at best, and so you should always be wondering, is this my last chance? Am I going into this crypt and that's going to be it for me? And so the feel of Night's Black Agents is different from the feel of Trail of Cthulhu. And then in a Night's Black Agents game, obviously the GM can adjust or sort of change up the horrors in a way and get the horror back if that's their goal. But the fundamental notion of your character should be ultra competence in Night's Black Agents and not so much in Trail of Cthulhu.
Yeah, and I think that it's funny. I think that I would have an easier time going back to Trail of Cthulhu, having read and understood the sort of the drama forward that was, I think, articulated in a better way, at least for me, in Night's Black Agents. Maybe because it was easier to read, or I enjoyed the material a great deal.
It's also because the game came out, 4 years later. So we had 4 years not just of people playtesting or playing, not even playtesting, but playing Trail of Cthulhu, giving us feedback, reading people on blogs, reading people on forums, RPGNet or yogsothoth.com or whatever, and finding out from the users what they thought worked and what they didn't think worked, what they missed in the rule book. I mean, there's rules that are right there in the trail, and they never noticed them until we sort of pointed out and say, hey, man, check this. And, page 69, guy, or whatever. Yeah. And so it's questions of organization, it's questions of clarity, it's questions of Robin and I taking turns rewriting basically the same material over and over and over again. And Robin's really good, and I'm no slouch. So just us, we've basically been polishing the draft of How to Play Gumshoe for 5 years now. It's not surprising that it got better, regardless of the difference between NBA as a game versus Trail as a game.
Sure. Something that has been talked about in some of the other interviews, and just it's a topic, is how do you make and sell and make a living making role-playing games? It's sort of a niche of a niche, right? Role-playing games is a niche of overall gaming, and every individual genre. The Night's Black Agents book and the other pieces are complete games. It's not here's a basic book and here's a genre expansion the way that, say, GURPS is. And I know that GURPS is going to try that with the Discworld game.
Well, they did it with Transhuman Space, and they did it with World War II also. I mean, they've done it every now and again.
They have. And is there any thought to sort of taking a step backwards, or maybe it already exists? Is there a Gumshoe core, and you say, okay, here's the basic rules, and then you can expand it?
No. There is a Gumshoe SRD because the system is now open, but that is not a play a game from this document unless you're already either a game designer or a gearhead, a guy who really wants to get under the hood on stuff. Our thought has always been that we always want, like I said, narrative forward, narrative first. If we're Gumshoe games are all about emulating a genre or a certain style of story. So Trail of Cthulhu is about emulating Lovecraftian horror adventure or mythos horror adventure, a horror mystery. Night's Black Agents is a vampire spy thriller. If we ever come up with a game that requires us to alter or twist or bend out of shape some of the core Gumshoe rules, what we don't want to do is say, go back to this other book and ignore part of it.
Right.
What we want to do is present a core rule set and then let people look at the game as an organic whole. Doing a Gumshoe core book would irrationally prejudice the status of Gumshoe as it existed at the moment that Robin and I put that book together. Whereas what should be given credence is what it says in the actual rule book that you're playing with, because that's the one where Robin has looked at it and said, does this really feel like Jack Vance's space adventure? Or I've looked at it and said, how do I make this more like the 4 minutes in the middle of the second Bourne movie that I'm really trying to emulate, right?
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense, and I think one of the hard things, and I'm running into this even in my meager thing, is people are like, well, what about this rule? And I turn it around like, well, what do you want it to be? And they're like, that's not the answer I'm looking for. I'm like, well, look, if you're doing something that's really gritty, realistic, and you want someone wrestling around to take 120 turns of GURPS game time because you have a 2-minute round and everything's going on there, then you're going to want to do it this way. And if you want this to be like Black Widow from Iron Man 2 flipping around 12 guys while Happy the Happy Puncher beats somebody to death or gets beaten to death in the background, then you're going to want to use these set of cinematic rules, and you have to pick. And I think the one thing one of the many things that I do like about the way that the Night's Black Agents and Trail of Cthulhu books are presented is that it is a complete game, and some of the work is taken out. And as I get older, I really appreciate pruning. As a GURPS author, I offer a toolkit for people to choose from because that's the way that the system is. But as a player and a game master, it's nice to have things done that help you.
I mean, both Trail and Nice Black Agents have, like I said, dials that allow you to pick and choose. So you can play a Nice Black Agents game that's more like Natasha Romanoff and less like Happy, or you can play a game that, people are more, low-key spies. They're more like George Smiley or Paul Christopher in terms of being a desk guy, not a super soldier. And so those are dials that exist within the game, but the game has a very strong default assumption. And I think that part of my job as the writer is to make the reader aware of this default and to make everything feel like if you don't do anything, you're going to be playing this kind of game.
Right.
And that kind of game that you're going to be playing, like I said, is Jason Bourne versus Dracula.
Right, which is all kinds of awesome. So one question that I do have about, or one comment, is one of the things that it strikes me about Gumshoe as a broad set of rules is that with the drama forward and with your ability to spend investigative points to sort of promote, you can spend points and make an NPC that was just kind of a also-ran. If the players are so inclined and the GM agrees, you can sort of say, oh, I'm going to spend 2 points in this, and all of a sudden the person of which you're asking a question can sort of be promoted to a major NPC. And as I was playing Trail of Cthulhu, it struck me that this could be a hard game to run. It's on the one hand story forward, but you really have to be on your toes when you're running it. And I don't know if that's unique to this style of narrative gaming, or if it's just, GMing a good story is always difficult. And when you're focusing on story, you're not just, okay, here's 12 orcs and you have to kill them, and where are you in the hex map or the square map if you're playing Pathfinder or something like that. And so maybe it's just a harder thing to do because writing is hard and storytelling is harder than it seems. So do you have any comments about whether this is an easy game to run or a hard game to run, or what modes that it is more approachable versus something where it's going to leave people either scratching their head or frustrated?
Well, I think that, obviously our goal, I think everyone's goal as a game designer, is to make a game that's easy to run, or at least fun to run. And what's hard for you to run is going to vary from player to player and from GM to GM. So I found 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons to be relatively hard to run just because there was so much rules mastery to climb. And if I ran the sort of, what you were talking about, 120 rounds of fist furious action GURPS, I would find that hard to run. When I run GURPS, I run it, much more rules light. I pull it way back. If I'm going to go deep into a tactical woods somewhere, it's going to be because there's a monster that really rewards that kind of tactical gameplay, and it's going to be more fun for the players to see themselves get eviscerated one round at a time, as opposed to run a GURPS game, but not with a lot of the very, technical sort of rule sets. And I think that every game master is maybe different, and there's people, obviously, there's thousands, tens of thousands of people who have no problem running D&D 3rd edition or Pathfinder because they're doing it right now, and it's just a matter of what you're willing to get mastery over. I think that as a writer, it pays me more dividends to get mastery over story creation, so I find Trail of Cthulhu or Nice Black Agents easier to run because they reward that story creating habit. If you're in the habit of looking at story and saying, what do we need for a story to happen, running a Gumshoe game is like falling off a log because it's just that simple. You make a story, you figure out where the players get into it, you find out, you figure out how they would get from A to B, and you put, guys with guns along the path, and that's a session. You're done. I think that there are mechanics that you can use to make running Gumshoe easier for people who don't think that way, and that's why I tried to put things in like the Van Pyramid and the Cons Pyramid to give people a little bit of a roadmap through. That's why we've introduced sort of we've blown out the spine and give that standard structure for an adventure like there is in the back of Trail and the back of Nice Black Agents. And if you just keep in mind that every game master is going to be different and every game master is going to need different things, the trick is to write a game that sort of, at the very least, supports all styles of game mastering, and ideally, provides more support for an area where the game itself shows off. So, in GURPS, the game really shows off if everyone knows all the fiddly plus twos. So writing a supplement that's, GURPS technical grappling is a great thing. If you're doing Gumshoe, the game really shows off when the story seems rich and vibrant and forward moving, and that's why when I write Nice Black Agents, I'm like, there needs to be a mechanic for the bad guys to do stuff, and I need to have it done so that people who haven't been spending 20 years of having Nyarlathotep slap people around can come up with something the way that I did.
Yeah, and the just to give a visual that will be fuzzy enough that people can't see it, and we're not gonna. There we go. So that is that's the Van Pyramid.
That's the Van Pyramid, yeah.
And then there's there's a couple other great little mnemonic devices. There's the Conspiramid, which it was really a fun piece where you say, okay, here are all the different levels, and the association map seemed to me to be a wonderful thing to tell a deeply layered story.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
go ahead, please.
I mean, that comes from, if you look at like The Wire, or you look at any show in which people are trying to find a bad guy, there's always that bulletin board in the corner with the pictures and the string. And I just think that that's a great element of those kind of stories, and I wanted to reward players for having that kind of element. And my players in the alpha playtest refused to do it because they thought it was too much work. So that's why there's mechanics in there that bribe players who do it. So if you put the bad guy into the adversary map, you get rewarded depending on how many connections you've found between him and the other pizzas of the universe. And so that, I think, it's part of my goal for making things feel like the source material in a way. And then it also turns out to be a really great way to generate story ideas, because players who've been using adversary maps, the GMs come back to me, or they go online and they say, I really don't have to write a game at all because the players are just following their own leads now.
Right.
And as a director of Nice Black Agents, or as any kind of GM, that's like gold to you, because then you can spend all the time coming up with atmosphere, thinking of the special powers of the monsters, or doing something else to make the story interesting, because the players have already fed themselves the hook.
But I like the Black Ops. That's John Ross's Black Ops. I thought that was tons of fun.
One of my 3 favorite GURPS books of all time.
And I like Jason Levine's Monster Hunters, which is really just Black Ops in 4th edition, or you could easily fit Black Ops into Monster Hunters.
Yeah.
And I love the Buffy the Vampire Slayer stories and Angel and that kind of blending of modern day and the supernatural, because it's not boring and run of the mill, and you're not going to have to worry about the terrorist of the week, and I don't need to. I can live in that world, and I've done tactical gaming with the GURPS and whatever, and it's, for me at least, it's greatly enjoyable. But sometimes it's fun to be stalked by zombies or attacked by werewolves, or you can shoot all you want, but you're shooting at your own shadow, and that never works out well or whatever. And it's the nice thing about the adversary map and the Conspiramid is it's a great way to sit down and you can just say, okay, I'm going to draw a couple levels here, and this is how things work out. And here's a deeply layered story, and in any one adventure, the odds of people, the players, leaping 3 things and finding you effectively in a mental hex crawl where you're totally unpopulated and you've just got this blank sheet of paper, and they're looking at you, and the pizza's getting cold and the beer's getting warm, which, unless you're in England, is not a good thing. And you're just left with nothing to do. And the nice thing about this is that it really doesn't take that much to say, okay, well, here are a couple of relationships. Pick out 2 or 3 relationships per box, and it expands geometrically, and you've got a year and a half of storytelling, plus the stuff that the players do to themselves. Because, like, oh man, wouldn't it be awful if ...
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's. I think I mentioned in the. It's either in Double Tap or it's in Nice Black Agents that if the players have decided the super tanker is full of blood, the super tanker is full of blood, and it's up to you to figure out why that happened, because it's just too cool if that's what happened.
Yeah, no, I mean it's yeah. So, and that's there's a blog that I follow. He's a new guy. I call him Mr. Insidious, but I think he calls it Insidious GURPS Planning, and he's basically running a GURPS espionage game that has all of these layers, and it was impressive. To have a story that was so deep, and it felt like an episode or a Bourne movie or an episode of Alias, which And
Right.
sometimes it gets so deep, you're like, oh dear God, but sometimes it's not, and you're like, wow, okay, I didn't see that one coming, and it's really an awful lot of fun.
Well, that's one of the
Um,
differences with the Conspiramid is because, again, the narrative first model implies an end, right? That there's an end to the story. There's a point at which Bourne has gotten to everyone in Treadstone. There's a point at which you've staked the last vampire, and as opposed to Alias, which is literally just flailing around until they get canceled, or the X-Files, or Lost, or any of these other serial television that don't have any notion of where they're going after they run out of the first batch of ideas. With Nights Like Agents, you know that there's an endpoint, and the players know that there's an endpoint, and so what might seem pointless, they know that Khan's pyramid is narrowing to a point, right? That at some point up here is Dracula or Elizabeth Bathory or immortal Joseph Stalin or something that is going to be drinking people's blood, and they are going to finally get to take that out or die trying, and that is a different. I think it's a different kind of a feel than something that's just either terrorist of the week or even mummy of the week if it's not you know, part of a story. I mean, picaresque storytelling is great, and there's nothing wrong with it, but for a thriller, you lose pacing and you lose momentum if there isn't a place you're going to, I find. And I
right,
certainly find watching it that that's the case.
right. Um, let's see. So I'm gonna ask you if David. So I'm gonna probably leave Gumshoe and Nice Black Agents for a little bit. We may come back to it,
Cool.
and I want to do GURPS last. But I do want to ask, since we're talking about storytelling and awesomeness and stuff like that, I have to ask, what led you, what inspired you to take the peanut butter that is World War II and the Asgardian legends that is the chocolate and mix them together into Day After Ragnarok?
Uh, I think the main thing that inspired me was the deadline. That began as a suppressed transmission called Reality Eartha, the day after Ragnarok, and it was one of those deals where Stephen Marsh is the most long-suffering and patient of people. I feel really proud of having been able to just lift him right up into Buddhist heaven. When he is not going to have to come back around the wheel again because of having to edit me for the majority of a decade. But he would have, he'd send me an email and he'd say, "Is this going to be a week we get a suppressed transmission?" And I would say, "Yeah, sure, absolutely, not a problem." And the deadline was, I forget what it was. It was like Wednesday night. Let's say it was Wednesday night was the deadline. Oh, no, because it bounced on Friday, right? It used to drop on Friday. So the deadline would be, I guess it was in theory Wednesday night, but in reality,
In reality,
it
it was
was
Friday
Thursday
morning.
night.
Yeah, okay.
So I would sit there and watch the clock tick and think, oh man, if I don't have something, Stephen is going to be, not sad, but just hurt. And so I would desperately try and think of anything to get the ball rolling. And for me, the suppressed transmissions always begin with those quotes, right? If you looked at my things, I really enjoyed that quality of the old the old White Wolf games, where they were just full of the evocative quote material. And I thought that was a fun way to sort of kickstart everyone, get everyone spinning in the right direction, is to do a little opener quote. And so I began, as I would read blogs or read anything during the day, I would save really juicy quotes in a quote file so that if I found myself dry, I could take one of them and say, all right, you're going to be a suppressed transmission today. And the one that I wound up finding, and let's see if I can quote it. Da, da, da. Where are you? There you are. Is right here in Day After Ragnarok.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
And it winds up opening the inspiration section here at the thing. Or no, it's in it's in the opening of the Serpent Fall. This is from a U.S. War Department counterintelligence assessment, right? That was written in February of 1945. So they're trying to get inside Hitler's head and figure out if he's going to surrender, what he's going to have planned. And this is right after the Bulge. The V weapons are going crazy. So they don't know what's going on. So this is their counterintelligence assessment. The Nazi myth, which is important to men like Hitler, requires a Götterdämmerung. Right?
Okay,
And that's
sure.
the quote. And that's the U.S. Army wrote that. So if you take that literally, what that means is Hitler has to be planning for the Götterdämmerung, for the end of the world. Right? That's
Sure.
something that he's got to have in his back pocket. And if you're doing the end of the world for the Nazis, it has to be the Teutonic Norse mythology end of the world,
Teutonic end of the world,
Ragnarok.
sure.
And so from there, it was just one little step to, okay, Hitler's plan is to bring about Ragnarok. And this is not something that is original necessarily to me. I mean, David Brin did it in Thor Meets Captain America and other stuff like this. But I think I'm the person who pushed it all the way to the end, where he actually, does try to end the world. And as to mention David Brin again, the secret message is the Nazis were schmucks. So obviously something goes wrong. What goes wrong with the end of the world? What defeats the end of the world before it can get started? That makes me think, okay, the Midgard serpent shows up. That's the opening of the end of the world. He rises up out of the sea. Thor, in the original myth, smites him and is killed dead by poison. In what's going to kill the Midgard serpent? And I thought, okay, the atom bomb will kill the Midgard serpent. They'll fly a B-29 right into the Midgard serpent's eye, detonate the atom bomb, and burn his brain out. And that image, then I'm thinking, okay, once you've done that, though, you've still got the Midgard serpent's body. This is not really solving the problem.
Right.
And so when the serpent falls across Europe and destroys, kills millions of people, and you got a 1-trillion-ton snake suddenly lying across Europe and Africa, that's where the story begins for me, because that's sense of wonder. That's high concept sense of wonder. That's worth doing something about. And once I had that image of the dead serpent lying across the world, I began to think, okay, that I can write. I can get 2,200 words out of a dead Midgard serpent lying across Europe. I mean, as you can tell, eventually I got considerably more than that. And then as I was writing it, I'm thinking, okay, what's the core story? Thor, when he destroys the Midgard serpent, has to be defeated. So, what destroys the United States? Well, the Midgard serpent fell, a super tsunami, right? So that'll take out the East Coast.
Eastern seaboard, right?
And then there's also a rain of radioactive serpent venom out of the sky, as the atomized head of the serpent, or the brain of the serpent, flows in a anomalous polar easterly out and rains down across North America. So the entire continent is now springing up with monsters. So in North America, you have a new Hyborian age. You have Conan the Barbarian, 1948, submachine guns and sorcery. And then on the other side of the equation, what happens to the rest of the world? Well, Stalin grabs off everything he can. And then I had to think, okay, why isn't Stalin now freezing to death in the world's worst drought? And I said, okay, we need a secret weapon for Stalin, and that was the frost giants. Obviously, the Jotun will be on Stalin's side, so they're keeping the Soviet Union from freezing to death for their own purposes. And in writing it, I ran across a myth of the Circassian peoples of the Caucasus Mountains, which are called the Narts, and these are sort of heroic giant figures that someone else has believed became the origin of the Knights of the Round Table, which is nonsense. But I ran across the Narts reading that book, and so I thought, well, if there's a Narts connection to the Jotun, then I can do that. And sure enough, online I found a guy named what is his name? It's like Colaroso. Yeah, John Colaroso's essay Prometheus Among the Circassians. He's drawing a parallel between Prometheus and the Narts, and so since Prometheus is dead in the Caucasus Mountains, it's the same sort of story. So I'm able to get my apocalyptic giants against the gods material there. What happens to the British? Well, what's left? Australia and India are pretty much what's left. Where's the British royal family on May whatever, or on Midsummer's 1945? Well, Prince Henry or the Duke of Gloucester, Henry Duke of Gloucester, is in Australia. He's the only surviving member of the royal family. He becomes king. So now we're rebuilding the British Empire in Australia. So now we have James Bond and Quatermass, and that Britain is the only important world country after the war feel. And all of this is going on as I'm trying to get to 2,200 words or 2,500 words, so I can send it to Stephen, so that he will be able to dump it into the proper format and put it up. And that's where that came from. That sort of desperate urgency. The reason that there's so much stuff in that world is, first of all, because I've sort of trained myself to create worlds in that way, right? To take the central concept and then build out, but also because I needed to fill it with sexy goodness to make Steven not mad at me.
Well, and that's a lot of sexy goodness per 2,200 words.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing to me, just as we've talked a little bit about the conspiramid and the adversary map, and what you've just sort of mapped out is kind of these concentric rings in a way, or it's spokes from a wheel. You start with a central concept and you say, okay, well, here's something. And then, well, what does that imply? And then here's one or two other things, and you proceed somewhere between linearly and geometrically, and you just go and go and go, and then you're like, okay, well, that's that spoke. You've got however many things, and that's kind of cool, and you got a lot of plot seeds there, and that's just one spoke, and then you've just gone around the wheel, so to speak, and all of a sudden you've got this awesome game world that supports multiple play styles within this world, and because you started from a core concept, it's self-consistent. And I've certainly learned something just from listening to how you did that about how to create an interesting game world and story. And I'll be darn well sure that that's the next time I plot out some kind of campaign world, that's what I'm going to do. Start with the core concept and say, okay, well, what does that imply? I think it has a lot in common with the sort of the science fiction-y, if you change one thing, one faster than light travel, or often faster than light travel and X, what happens?
Mm. But even with those, they still have to decide what core story they're telling.
True.
Right. I mean, I could have done the one thing is Ragnarok half happens, but if I don't know that in North America I'm doing Conan, I don't say I get, but one can get design paralysis.
Sure.
Because now I don't know what happens in North America. Oh, I don't know. But it's like, nope, I know what I want. I want this to look like the Hyborian Age. I want there to be a bunch of little tiny city-states. I want there to be no government. I want there to be snake monsters everywhere. I want wandering mercenaries to be able to be in a seller's market. I want those things that are part of the Hyborian Age. And how do I make that happen to the eastern two-thirds of the United States? And then every decision I make that's world building feeds that feel and that play style. Like, I want Britain to be sort of, like it is in those 1940s and 1950s stories, that thin red line against Soviet communism, thin red line against the Japanese Empire. I want, a British spy to be an important person in this world. I want Professor Quatermass to be an important person in this world, although I had to call him Professor Childermass because he's not public domain. But the notion is that you have to decide what kind of story you're telling and then make plausible decisions that reinforce that story, because that's the other half of it. Certainly making a plausible decision is crucial, and it's why I always start with Earth when I'm making a game world, because I know how the Earth works. I live there, and it's documented. It's the best documented game world in existence, and even the maps are better. But I find that you have to both have a sense of how the Earth's things react in normal circumstances, and then also a sense of what kind of story you want to tell to make sure the parts that you put into the book reinforce that story.
Although it's interesting to think, when that goes poorly and well, and I'm going to offer my own opinions on two versions of that. Well, I think, is Babylon 5, where you had a beginning, Straczynski had an end, and you got there with only a couple network interferences where you had to compress all of Season 4 and 5 into Season 4, and then say, holy crap, what stories do I want to tell in Season 5? But, I thought it was one of the best pieces of continual science fiction, and to your point, you got to the end of the Conspiramid. You got to the top. You were kind of sort of done. And he had some extensions, but it was good. Where things went awry, and I think that this is where maybe either poor decisions were made or whatever, is like Battlestar Galactica. I thought the first season was awesome. Maybe the second season or the first half of it was great. But after that, it lost its way, and you sort of felt like, a little bit like all 172 books of the Robert Jordan Wheel of Time series, where Jordan had the end. He knew what that last scene was going to be, and he knew what the beginning was going to be, and then he just kind of went places. and it wasn't always directed. Like you described fairly directed steps from here's my core concept, here's the Hyborian Age, and I'm going to have a half dozen steps between them, as opposed to we're going to kind of go around here. And so everything was spoke like. So I mean, it was interesting to see what could go well and what could go poorly. But
well, if I was being paid as much as Robert Jordan was, I would have taken a lot longer to get there too. But
but
my market rewards concision, not aimless drift. So trust me, if someone wants to pay me for aimless drift, they'll see that I'm more than capable of it. I just don't think that it's something that the audience wants.
Do you have an eidetic memory or anything like that? Because I mean, you seem to make all these wonderful connections, and you pull them out of the air. And obviously, this is your life and what you do, and it's good to be good at what you do. And it's how you get there in a way. But I mean, is that a skill that you developed, or just something that you have built upon, or a little bit of both?
I have a trick memory. When I was younger and before I was drinking, it was probably eidetic. My mom used to claim that I would know where on the page something was, which is a sign of a photographic memory. I can't take any credit for it any more than I could take credit for green eyes. It's just, a genetic quirk. And then I think that I have natively one of those brains that does well on the SATs. The Templars are to the Matamoros murder cult as the space shuttle is to blank. One of those type things. And then...
it's because there's got to be a question on the SATs that no one can answer.
Yeah, but it's that kind of analogic thinking, I guess, or analytic thinking to an extent. But it's more analogic, and I think my brain just does that well because I scored, really. And again, literally, this means nothing except for getting into undemanding colleges. I scored well on the SAT, but I think it's because that's how my brain works now. Because, like you say, this is my job, and because it's also my hobby, I've sort of probably trained myself to think like that. And so when I look at a piece of source material or a piece of geek fun or a comic book or a story or whatever, part of my brain is now analyzing it and looking both for how it does or doesn't build as a structure, and also what kind of universal joints are sitting in there that could maybe be pulled out, given a half spin, and plugged back in. So when I looked at I did the Star Wars in 1000 AD in a suppressed transmission, that's just a matter of knowing enough about 1000 AD to know what fits Star Wars. And that was tied in because Christopher Lee talked about owning the Sword of Charlemagne or something like that. And I'm like, well, there we go. Now I have a connection. And again, it's just that matter. I've done I think actually the Star Wars thing was a different one because I did Lord of the Rings in 1000 AD, which I called Ring of the Lords. Now that I think about it, but yeah, it's it's just a matter of keeping an eye out for things that can give you enough of a connection that you can connect them to other things, or stories that are rich or nubbly enough at least that you can lay them out and fill them with other stuff and people will still recognize it. That's why, for all of its flaws, Star Wars really works for that, because there is a lot going on, but it's all generally going in the same direction, and people can recognize it. And if you disguise the Jedi Order as something, people will say, "Oh, that's the Jedi. That's so cool."
Right. As you're looking through source material, as you're reading these blogs, are there particular turns of phrase or keywords is the wrong word, but so I feel like I'm an analog thinker as well. Unfortunately, I have a tendency towards tangency because I'll be thinking of stuff, and even at work at my day job, which is science and rigor and all that stuff. Ooh, why?
Oh yeah, you get a beverage.
I have a great wife.
Yeah. Hey.
Yes. Out of curiosity, vaguely globally, where are you right now?
I'm in Chicago, the greatest city in the world.
I went to grad school there, or close by.
So not at UFC then? At Evanston?
Yep, I was at Northwestern. So are there turns of phrase that you're looking for as you're reading some of the source material where you're like, oh, that sets me off in a tangent, or oh, that's something that I'm going to be able to connect to something else? Is there something as you're reading this stuff, or is it really just having a prodigious background in oddities, and you're like, oh, this reminds me of this because either of a turn of phrase or a picture or a temporal event, or how does that work when you connect these dots like that?
Well, I mean, some of it works just on a thematic level, right? You are looking, and if you've got, two guys who are fighting over who gets to be king, that's a pretty common story, right? You can see it in the Wars of the Roses, you can see it in, every presidential election, but it's also in King Arthur, right?
Sure. Yep.
So now you're like, okay, once you've identified that sort of, squib as something that's in King Arthur, you can keep an eye out for it, and sure enough, you'll see it a lot. Or a love triangle. Again, you can tie any love triangle into King Arthur. You can tie any uh, um, father-son conflict into most of British history, but also into Star Wars. I mean, you got these sort of very common, super common, Polakov-level common plot elements that if you want to read reality as fiction, you can recognize them plenty of times. And again, in reality, if this were a movie, we'd be saying, "Oh, come on, seriously?
Right.
A Second World War, also against Germany, and the guy's still got a mustache? What the hell?" Oh yeah, and of course Germany's much bigger this time, even though it got beat in the first movie. They'll probably have some super weapon. Look at that,
Oh yeah.
You'd look at that and you'd say this is tiresome, unbelievable fiction, but that's because fiction comes out of our lived experience of the world. So I think if you start recognizing those sort of historical patterns, you start seeing them everywhere, and a lot of that is just reading history that is sort of at a high enough the camera's high enough that you're not reading down to individual quotidian lives. You're looking at sort of larger movements of the story, and it may even still be an individual quotidian life. It's just that it's Napoleon's life or Queen Elizabeth's life, and so you have to sort of follow along with that. And then another part of it is just some people or some concepts have a habit of being good and sticky. So the Templars can be fit into virtually anything. Anything that you're reading along, someone mentions the Templars, you're like, I can now tie that somewhere if I need to. Sometimes people will do you the favor of deliberately living their lives along mythic lines. Alexander the Great, tried to pattern his existence after Achilles and after Hercules. So you're really, really, helped out if you're trying to do anything weird with Alexander the Great. Napoleon tried to pattern his life after Alexander the Great. So there you go. Now we have a lovely second-order thing.
Sure.
Himmler thought he was a reincarnated Henry the Fowler, so you've got a connection there if you want to make it. And so it's just a matter of, I guess, being aware of things that are going to recur a lot. The Olmecs are really, really interesting, but they don't show up in a lot of stuff that isn't about Mesoamerican history. Queen Elizabeth and Shakespeare and John Dee show up in all kinds of things that have nothing to do with Tudor England. So you just have to sort of have an eye out for what shows up a lot, and then read widely. Don't just read in the area that you're interested in, because then you're only going to see your own stuff. Read, science fiction and horror and fantasy. Read comics and watch movies. Be a broad consumer, not a narrow consumer, and you'll wind up seeing that more things are beginning to pattern match, especially once you start looking for them, because we are, as a species, genetically programmed to pattern match. That's how we fed ourselves for 3 million years.
Right. One of the best and the worst things that ever happened to me was a brief 1-hour seminar on film at Rice University by the Master of Hands in College at the time, Professor Dennis Houston. And he loves Westerns. And he's as he should. And he's like, let me, he has great voice, let me show you this. And he's going to watch what the camera does. It moves, and you see the badge, and you see the ring, and you see this, and this all happens. Nothing that you see on this screen is there accidentally. Everything that you're watching happened because the director put it there. It all has meaning. There are no random cutscenes in movies. They're edited. And I was like, oh my God. And I am so rarely surprised anymore by film and TV that when it happens, it's a wonderful thing. But it's like, oh, crap. They just flashed to this guy when they were talking about the secret conspiracy. Well, now we know who the betrayer is.
Yeah.
To your point about
there are ways to do that better or worse. I don't know if you've seen American Hustle, and I don't want to do any spoilers, but if you are in the habit of watching things for that, and at the end of American Hustle, you will very possibly have one of those moments where it's like, oh, they warned me, but I thought it was one thing, but now I realize that they actually warned me. Or in
Right.
Brick, the great Dashiell Hammett in a high school film, Brick. Very early in the movie, there's a line that gives away the entire mystery, which, again, anyone who's read Dashiell Hammett, the mystery was pre-given away because Dashiell Hammett only had 2 endings, and it uses one of them.
Right.
But because the movie is the way the movie is, you don't parse that as the solution until it's revealing itself to you at the same time it's revealing itself to the director. So what I guess I'm saying is that a good editor or a good director, first of all, there are plenty of bad editors and bad directors. There's all kinds of stuff that's in there accidentally.
I suppose so,
but
yeah.
but also, a good editor and a good director will feed you the solution, and in such a way that you miss it, and then when it comes back, you kick yourself. Obviously, I think that's the whole message of House of Games, right? The Mamet movie is that I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, and you're still not going to understand it until it's too late.
Right.
Black Swan is the same way, the Darren Aronofsky film, where he's literally telling you the same story 5 different ways, and every time he tells, and when he tells you the last one, because you are so invested in the story, you are in the moment and you are surprised, even if you're not actually surprised. But again, I mean, if you watch, say, a movie of Othello, right, you're not like, oh, I hope that nice Desdemona gets away. You know that's not going to happen, right?
Right.
The difference between a good version of Othello and a bad version of Othello is, in a good version of Othello, you still care. And in a bad version of Othello, you're like, whatever. I mean, this is, people say, oh, you can't, give away the ending. It's like, anytime you watch a Shakespeare play, anytime you watch a movie from a book you've read, the ending is given away because you knew it, right? When we watched The Lord of the Rings, was it like, oh, I know he's gonna get his finger bitten off and Gollum's gonna go into the volcano. I know how that's gonna end. There's no point watching. No, the point to watching is, how is it gonna be sold to you? How will you have that fed? What are the music cues gonna be? What is the performance gonna be like? How is Frodo gonna react? How is Elijah Wood gonna play it? Right? Those are the mysteries that you're watching the movie to see. And if it's a good movie, you want to see it over and over again, even though you've in theory, how it ends, right? But you don't, because you want to see it develop.
And that's a good. I have a whole wall of movies, not behind me, that are basically popcorn movies, right? I am inordinately fond of Thor. I've written on it about my blog, and partly it's because I can watch. I mean, watching Anthony Hopkins as Odin, or Odin as Anthony Hopkins, depending on your point of view, is a wonderful thing, and they did it very well. But I can watch it over and over and over again. Whereas if I, for example, look at a movie like Black Hawk Down, which I read the book, I knew how it was going to end. I think I've seen it once or twice, and the same thing, honestly, with Saving Private Ryan. It was such an intense movie that I didn't feel like going back to revisit it, not because it was a bad story. They were wonderful stories. But the impact was so high the first time that I didn't need to re-experience it, whereas watching Avengers for the 764th time, I can just enjoy the candy of it.
Well, it's the difference between a pleasurable impact and a painful impact. And, I'm not going to say that one is superior or one is inferior, but in general, you don't go back to things that made you uncomfortable. And the question is, to what extent is great art supposed to make you uncomfortable? I, conversely, have watched Black Hawk Down a lot because I just think it's a fantastic piece of filmmaking. And also because it's just a riveting story and a great war movie. But my wife, for example, won't watch Chinatown a second time.
Okay.
Yeah, because, again, it's a great movie and it's a phenomenal story. Robert Towne did a great job, but, it's a very emotionally harrowing thing to watch. So, yeah, I haven't watched Chinatown a lot of times either myself.
Yeah, no, and I think the thing that really got me about Black Hawk Down is I could handle pretty much everything except for the injured soldier, because I have this thing about veins. and that didn't... I still get squicky when I have to think about that scene.
And that's a different question entirely. I mean, it's just a squick factor, right? As great a movie as Groundhog Day is, I can't watch it all the time because it has Anne McDowell in it. So, the same thing. Open vein, Andy McDowell.
And my wife was the same way for a long time until we watched the movie Sliding Doors. She would not watch Gwyneth Paltrow in anything.
Well, that's a different question. I mean, Gwyneth is well. I mean, we're not really doing a film blog, so maybe that's for another issue of
I actually,
Gaming Ballistic.
one thing that I do on my blog, though, periodically, I have these things called apropos of nothing because, role playing and media entertainment, it's just different kinds of having fun. And so, the concept of taking a film and doing it as a role playing game, or actually the question that I was actually going to ask because you cued it in my mind, is what kind of things make great stories and what kinds of things make good stories that are good for role-playing games, to sort of bring it back to that, is do you distinguish in your mind, oh, this is a great story that I can tell, versus, oh, this is a great world in which I can tell stories?
Yeah, the key thing, I think, for a world in which you can tell stories is that the characters haven't already been written for you. Right? I mean, in 99% of role-playing games, maybe 90% now, but in the vast majority of role-playing games, you can't assume that the players are going to play the 5 iconic guys from the show, right? If you're making a Star Trek game, as I've made 2 of, you can't assume people are going to be Kirk, Spock, McCoy, Uhura, and Sulu, right? You don't know that they're going to do that. Even if they were doing original series Star Trek, they might be doing, Scotty Chekhov, Mr. Leslie, and Chief Officer Kyle or something. You'd have no idea what they're going to be doing. And you certainly shouldn't be doing that in a world of your own creation because it's just very, very narrow, right? It's limiting. And the most writers, and for perfectly understandable reasons, make their characters really central and really interesting and many really memorable. So when you're looking at something like Edgar Rice Burroughs, Tarzan is fascinating and interesting and powerful and neat, but his Africa is kind of a blank slate. There's sort of jungle and some natives and every now and again a lost Roman city, but there's nothing really about Tarzan's Africa that isn't true about anyone else's Africa or H. Rider Haggard's Africa. And, Barsoom is a factor of John Carter, not really a factor of Barsoom. The Hyborian Age without Conan, you could write stories set in the Hyborian Age, but 9 times out of 10 you're just writing Conan fanfic.
Sure.
Because your barbarian is, his name is Nonak, he's a whole different guy, and he's from the east, not the north. But it's the same thing. But the great thing about Lovecraft, and to take this background on the mythos, is he's a guy who literally thought that the characters should be meaningless, because that was the point, right? That humanity is meaningless. So his cipher characters make the game universe pop, right? The background really comes alive for Lovecraft in a way that even for Tolkien, who is one of the best background guys in the business, there's really only one story, right? And it's the story of the Fellowship and Frodo, destroying the ring. And if you're playing in that third age and you're not destroying the ring, that you're like a B-roll story. That meanwhile, a bunch of guys in Angmar were doing something. It's like whatever.
Right.
So that is the problem with that. And so while Middle-earth is a great world to adventure in, I think it's harder to pull out what you do if you're not destroying the ring. And where the Federation is a fine world to adventure in, it's harder to pull out what if you're not the one starship that gets to break all the rules all the time and meet godlike aliens and have all this stuff happen to it. And so I think that a world that is a good place for gaming is a place that's a good place for other stories to happen. And if you look at, say, Harry Potter, and you can imagine stories that are happening that are good and compelling and as interesting as the story of the boy who lived defeating the worst wizard ever, you can tell stories in it. Or, of course, you can think about deliberately dropping your gaze or telling stories that are not epic world-beater stories. If again, World War II, or you're doing a game set in World War II, you're not going to be the guy who kills Hitler, because, spoiler, that's Hitler. But second of all, you're not going to be the most important guy in World War II, because there is no most important guy in World War II, and that will let you sort of be free to think of an individual story for your setting. But a bad setting for games, even if it may be a great setting for stories, is one where the story and the world are so intertwined around one set of characters that it's difficult to impossible to figure out how to separate them. You can't game in Anna Karenina because the world, while it's the Russian aristocracy, the story is just about one woman making an idiot choice and suffering for it.
So I think to sort of steer this, not steer, but to bring it to the last topic is, I do a lot of writing about GURPS because it's kind of from where I do, and I want to talk a little bit about GURPS horror, Madness Dossier, if there's anything you can say about it. But also there was a question that a friend of mine asked, which is sort of what part of the original Scott Herring second edition manuscript did you adopt or co-opt? What did you do yourself, and how did you get from second edition to third edition in the horror book?
Well, with GURPS Horror, first of all, a little unfair to J.M. Caparula, I have to say to your friend, because he, of course, did the second edition. Scott did the first edition. I think that what I did at the time was I took my book, Nightmares of Mine, which had just reverted to me after Iron Crown went bankrupt, and the goal was to take all of the horror advice in that and turn it into GURPS Horror, using GURPS Horror, which, of course, I based much of the horror advice in Nightmares of Mine on, because it's a really great book. And to take what we took out was, I believe, mostly just the settings. We took out the 1920s setting, we took out the Victorian setting, because the notion was that those would have their own GURPS books. There's been a GURPS, there was a GURPS Cliffhangers, I think, coming out at the same time, and GURPS Steampunk was in development when I was doing Horror Third, so the notion was we didn't need those settings anymore. And so pretty much most of the meat and a lot of the words from second edition, and a lot of the words that Scott wrote, and certainly some of the pieces of advice that I merely restated in Nightmares of Mine, I just left in their original GURPS version. So what I did was I took that little tiny thin book. Steve told me to take out a third of it already, and then I replaced it with the larger 128-page third edition book. And then when it came time to do fourth edition, it was just a matter of build onto that, add more stuff. So yeah, I mean, basically, as far as I'm concerned, like I say in the introduction to fourth edition, the heart of that book is Scott's first edition book, and it's still beating in the fourth edition book. I'm pretty sure that if you went over it with a highlighter, you could find paragraphs that have moved from first to fourth unchanged.
Sure. And that's just looking over the. Unfortunately, I can't flash up my fourth edition hardback because it's in the mail. I am scrolling through the PDF file, and I really will admit that it's clear from what you just said. I mean, there's a great horrors about fear, and yeah. There you go. Awesome.
Waving a book.
Yeah. Good.
That.
It is pretty. Anyway, it's chapter 2, things that go bump in the night is okay, pick a monster, and then fear of taint, fear of nature, fear of madness, fear of mutilation, fear of starvation, fear of the universe, fear of the unnatural. So every one of these reflections, and then there's another half dozen more. Mm-hmm. Every one of these reflections on fear, panic, death, scare, the things that populate a horror episode are gone through, and the thing that's wonderful about this is it's got a little mini. It seems like it's either a mini bestiary. I don't know if there are stats. Let me grab to the zombie 90, since Sean just wrote an entire book on them. Mm-hmm. Yeah, zombie 111 minus 111 points. So there are templates.
Yeah, well, there's a bunch of templates. Zombie.
There are character templates as well as monster templates.
Yeah.
One of the knocks that GURPS gets, and I think somewhat unfairly, because they're not collected in one place, is GURPS doesn't have a bestiary.
GURPS has 3 bestiaries.
It has. Well, I mean, the fourth edition. Fourth edition does not have a formal bestiary. But what it has is Dungeon Fantasy Monsters 1 and a crap ton of stuff that get put in appropriate genre books that you can extract.
Yeah. In the zombie, there are the zombie, as well as lenses for fast and slow zombies under zombie. Then B-movie zombies, which are the non-fantasy version, your good old Living Dead. Voodoo zombies, which are both a undead voodoo zombie and a zombified human template. And so that of the zombies, there are, depending on how you count lenses, either 3 or 7 different kinds of zombies. So I think that's pretty good. And then Fear of Death also contains the mummy and the Lilitu, which was a new monster for 4th edition, I think. And the Lilitu contains under it templates for the Ardot Lili, the Cihuateo, which is the Aztec version of the aerial vampire spirit of a weeping woman, and the classical Lamia from Greek myth, the Lamashtu, which is a specific demon, and the good old Strix. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff, and that's just under Fear of Death. Yeah, there's a ton of monsters in GURPS Horror. That was part of the remit because, yeah, I mean, you're running horror, you want to have that.
Yeah, and you know, I think that it's a great plug for both your book as well as a great source of, you know, I guess representational piece, right? You know, what is an orc? An orc is is an orc. What does an orc represent the fear of? Is it fear of madness? Is it fear of a barbarian? Is it fear of the other? Is it, you know, just fear of lack of civilization? You know, is it fear of random violence? You know, so you say, okay, this is my monster. It's going to represent blah, and then you pick up the book and you say, okay, am I talking about a fear that's been identified here? And you haven't missed much. And then if you can't take something directly, certainly you can improvise.
And a lot of these monsters can be cast as different kinds of fear. I mean, the werewolf can be the fear of nature, or he can be the fear of sex, or he can be the fear of madness, and it just depends on how you want to play it and how you want to spin it. And I just had to pick them somewhere. But even that came out of 2nd edition, which may have come out of 1st edition. I don't have my copy of 1st right nearby where I can double check. But there's a bit in there where it talks about what does the vampire really represent.
Yes,
you know,
no, it's definitely in 2nd edition. Yep.
If you're doing a Civil War vampire, maybe he's being followed by pigs instead of rats, and if he's a nuclear Holocaust vampire, maybe he's followed by glowing cockroaches or something. And so I thought, well, that's a kind of a neat concept. How do I really blow that up and play with it? And that's what got me in 3rd edition to come with the idea of, well, since he's said this once kind of offhand for the vampire, why don't I say it really loud, not just for the vampire though, but for all the sort of standard monsters, find all the fears, and then when I expanded 3rd into 4th, I was able to add more fears. Again, either people had said, you know, where's the fear of hunger? That's a pretty big fear, starving to death. Or I just more that I would come up with, like the fear of the state. I wanted to have, you know, Men in Black in there as a monster because I, by that time, had suspected the GURPS Conspiracies was not going to come around anytime too soon. So I wanted to make sure that my Men in Black got in there.
Yeah, and then there's of course the you know, a horror game like, you know, Trail of Cthulhu is or you know, whether you're doing it in GURPS or anything, a horror story is hard to tell without certain willing sort of conspiracy from the players. And you know, the advice that's given in there is what's your favorite piece that you put in there on how to take a campaign and make it horrific, or, you know, even take an episode. I mean, because that's the nice thing about horror is it doesn't have to be all horror all the time. You know, you could even say that the second Aliens movie could, you know, with a little bit of, well, the first Aliens movie was a horror flick, the second one was action horror, but you know, easy to tweak out.
Yeah, I think that, you know, my favorite piece of advice is the one that you call up because it's the most important piece of advice. Horror is different from other kinds of games. Everyone has to want it to happen, or else it doesn't happen, because you're tapping into a not just an emotion, but it's an emotion that's so much more powerful when shared, right? And so that notion that horror is a collaboration, not a contest, is the fundamental insight for running good horror games. And if you don't have that, it's very hard to run horror no matter how much other advice you follow. And if you do have it, it's very hard not to be able to run horror no matter how much other advice you don't follow. And that's why I, you know, made it a front and center in Nightmares of Mine, which I think is the reason that everyone really liked Nightmares of Mine. And then when I turned that into GURPS Horror 3rd edition, I made it front and center again in GURPS Horror 3rd. And I'm fairly sure that I got pieces of that out of GURPS Horror, but I got pieces of that out of Chill and out of talking to John Tynes and out of everyone else who's ever tried to run horror. Because again, it's really elementary. It's first, you know, it's fundamental foundational stuff. And if you don't have that, you're just not going to be able to run a horror game. You
know, and that's the other thing that is true is, you know, not all groups of, not just the players, but the characters. And Peter Del Orto just did an interesting blog post about the difference between player and character. And when writers of games started to really make that decision, because that was sort of blended in the first iterations of D&D. But you can have a group of characters of which, say you got 6 players or whatever, and they've each got a character. 4 of them have recognizable fears, and 2 of them are either not played that way or just don't have any hooks on the character sheet. That'd be interesting. You'd almost have to seek out the players and say, look, what is your character afraid of?
Those players may be signaling that they're just not the type who want to be part of the story.
Right.
They like playing sidekicks. They like playing hangers back. Maybe they're people who just are being at the game because it's cheaper than a movie, and so they just want to watch the story unfold. Or maybe they're someone's boyfriend, and they're just along to keep their inamorata happy. But I think as long as if you have 4 out of 6 players with hooks, that'll fill any reasonable campaign. As long as the other 2 people are willing to be scared and aren't just going to be on their phone or making Monty Python references, or whatever kids make now that Monty Python's been gone for 50 years. But you know what I mean. Whatever kind of useless reference people are making nowadays. As long as they're going to be involved in the emotional content of the story, it's less important that there be a hook about them.
Agreed. And I guess
as the game goes forward, maybe they'll feel more confident and or accidentally take part in a story such that you can make them the hook. And it's like, oh, remember that time you touched the amulet? Well, guess what?
And I guess the last question, just to because you've been very generous with your time, for which I thank you. Madness Dossier. Rumors and playtest, and is there anything you can tell us about that?
Madness Dossier right now is in the magical production hands of I guess it's Nikki that does production, whoever it is that does production. But
Nikki. Yep.
But they've got it. I did my bit where I picked the quotes to go in the quote box, and I have done my final edits based on typos and space filling and things like that. So I think that my part is done, and it's up to the Steve Jackson grist mill to grind it as fine as they decide they want to. In terms of content, I have no real problem teasing stuff if you got more specific questions. But basically, it's the Madness Dossier campaign back from the old the old 3rd edition. And instead of being just 3 pages or whatever it was, it's now expanded to I want to say 48, but I'm pulling up the PDF and I'll look and tell you in 2 shakes as soon as Preview decides it wants to pay attention. Oh no! Look at that. Oh, it's 64 pages.
Oh, wow, nice.
So it's a 64-page PDF, and it's it's a GURPS book. You know what those look like. And it's sort of follows the what they called for the GURPS organization's model. So there's the standard stuff about an organization in GURPS, and there's lots of templates for the kinds of people that are put in charge of that are part of Project Sandman. I guess I should sort of hit the high concept for people who haven't.
Yeah, please do, because
seen GURPS 3rd.
I have of GURPS this, and for some reason, because this was for 3rd edition, I thought this was horror 3rd edition, and so I have 4th, I have 2nd, and I was looking around, I'm like, Madness Dossier, not finding it. It's all over the internet, and I can find references to it and how awesome it is, but where is it? And so, it's the edition that I missed.
Well, if Douglas Cole doesn't have it, then obviously it is not it is not available to everyone. I guess the basic concept is that around World War II, the U.S. and British governments operating independently discovered that there was a previous universe, and that previous universe had been edited out of existence when our universe replaced it about 535 AD in what I call the Ontoclism, in a big reality quake. And if you look at GURPS 4th, Dave Pulver took reality quakes out of horror and made them part of the GURPS 4th physics, I guess. And then I took them again out of GURPS 4th and put them into infinite worlds for people to follow along. But a reality quake is like an earthquake in which you have one history, and then the earthquake comes along and shifts all the ground around. But since it's a reality quake, your history is changed retroactively. So the Bronze Age and the past and everything that we know happened since 535, before 535 AD, has only been true since 535 AD. And it's a concept that I took from Mary Gentle's novel Ash, but it's also obviously from Borges's Plan Uqbar Orbis Tertius, and which I think probably the most fan-accessible version of that is Dream of a Thousand Cats in Sandman, where if 1,000 cats all dream that they are once again the dominant species of the planet, it will always have been true. But what happened was that 1,000 humans dreamed that they were, and now humans being dominant has always been true. And so that's sort of the notion of a reality quake. So this reality quake, in the previous version of history, the true version of history, there are these monstrous entities known as the Anunnaki, which is a Sumerian term, who ruled the world. They ruled humanity, and they programmed us to obey them by programming our language to contain the core of our own subjugation. So the language Sumerian is a perfect control system for human brains, or it contains a perfect control system for human brains. And so after the reality quake happened, our languages still got these control surfaces in it, but no one was doing anything until the eruptors, these beings from History B, began seeping into our universe and trying to control us so that they would be able to bring about a reverse of the ontoclism and snap History B back into existence and end our history, which is called History A. And so like I say, around World War II, the British and the American governments figured this out and set up a secret joint task force called Project Sandman, whose job it is to keep the Red King asleep, to keep the Anunnaki asleep and not in our reality. And so what they do is they go around and they find people who have begun believing in the old history, and they change their minds or they kill them. And they find eruptors and they destroy them and cover up any evidence that they ever were there. They use memetics, they use neuro-linguistic programming, they use subliminal messages, they use the Anunnaku's own control system against their foes, which is parlous on both moral and practical levels. And they've begun to develop a wetware hacking, where they'll hack your brain with a computer to change the way you think. And so it's basically a heroic conspiracy of people who are using the worst kind of mind control and subversion, but in fight against a truly cosmic, world-ending evil. And it's the same old standard Western narrative, right? That you have to pick up the gun and be a barbarian in order to keep the civilization safe, but done in sort of a William S. Burroughs, Jorge Luis Borges sort of métier.
Interesting.
And that's what it is. So it's a mind space techno thriller, I suppose.
Did this appear in? Did David do something with this? I remember this plot outline. I remember the term eruptors. I remember a lot of this stuff, and I'm trying to remember where I read it.
It gets mentioned in 4th edition very briefly, and then it's more mentioned in Infinite Worlds, but it's not laid out even to the degree that it was in Horror 3rd.
Okay. I'm trying to remember if maybe there was a pyramid article on that.
I think Dave has done a pyramid article on it, although he might have. I don't have.
It would have been an eidetic memory column or something like that. But anyway, because the concepts are familiar to me, and the Anunnaku and eruptors and all of those phrases. I know that I've heard this stuff, and to have that expanded into a 64-page campaign book is really neat, and can't wait for it. So, and I'm a bit of a collector, so I'm sure that I'll ring that cash register.
What kind of collector can you be if you don't have Horror 3rd? I mean, come on.
I somehow missed it. That might have been at a time where I was doing enough playtesting that I was getting a lot of books for free, but hard to say. how that works. No, and it may have been that I wasn't going edition pieces. I'm more of a collector now that I have more money.
Mhm.
And so one last question. Night's Black Agents.
Here's horror
Would
third.
excuse
So
me?
you'll recognize it when you see it. This is
Yeah,
third edition
no.
horror, right?
Yep.
Okay. Night's Black Agents, right?
Yeah, would, at least in my mind, would make a great GURPS campaign because it's got all the tactical crunch, high-powered. It would make either as a subgenre of Monster Hunters or as a standalone, and you could even pull in Sean's impulse buys to do some of the investigative skill stuff. Would there be any ever possibility of making a spin-off, or are you doing most of your creation in Gumshoe World, or you're a freelance writer, so you write for where there's interest?
Well, I mean, first of all, Night's Black Agents is I don't own it. I wrote it for hire. Pelgrane owns that property, so Simon would have to license it to Steve, and Steve, I'm fairly sure, has been turned off of licensing other people's games.
Yes.
Pretty comprehensively. So that would be the first problem with it. The second is that, as you note, there's a lot of GURPS in it. I think that in my designer's notes, I list probably a dozen GURPS books, something like that. A lot of GURPS books. So
that'll teach me to read the bibliography.
I mean, I dug through and I shout out to Gun Fu, Tactical Shooting, High Tech, Covert Ops, Special Ops, SWAT, Action, Undead, Monster Hunters, Blood Types, and Horror, all of which I went and dug into very thoroughly to make sure that my game contained everything you could do in those games, or at least enough of a grit that you could feel like you were doing everything you could do in those games. And I think that if you are a GURPS player who absolutely doesn't want to play any other game, you can buy your copy of Night's Black Agents and then run it in Monster Hunters, right? I mean, you take Monster Hunters, you take Horror, you take Blood Types or whatever. If you look at the way that I build out the vampires as modular collections of powers, obviously that's how GURPS builds everything.
Yeah. No, actually, as I was reading through, I sort of read through the book twice, and the first time I read through it, I'm like, okay, what are these investigative skills? What would they be? And then there was some of the pieces were like, okay, this is going to be a reputation, and this is going to be an advantage, and this is going to be something else. It's an easy convert.
Yeah.
If you want to spend the time to do it, I agree. So that's I have to ask because I had a great time as lead playtester on Tactical Shooting. Did you enjoy that? I mean, do you enjoy the crunch parts of the book, or only really as story elements?
I always love reading them because I think by and large they are good examples of how to do game design, right? I think the core GURPS engine is a great engine, and I love it, and I've always loved it. And when I see people try and mod things with it, it's usually worth my time as a game designer just to see how they've modded it. And now, if it's on a topic that I'm really interested in, like shooting, I read GURPS Tactical Shooting, and I think that's a terrific idea, but I don't think I'd ever run it because it would slow down a gunfight to a miserable crawl, right? I mean, if you're having to do all of that calculation in your head and apply all those modifiers all the time, it's just going to, the gunfight at the OK Corral should last as long as the gunfight at the OK Corral, or, maximally it should last 5 times as long as the gunfight at the OK Corral. If you've spent more than 15 minutes having a gunfight, you've done a gunfight wrong. It doesn't feel like a gunfight anymore. You might as well play a war game now because that's what you're doing. And so in my own personal gaming style, I don't have a need for those rules, but I like reading how they're done. But that's because I'm a designer, not necessarily because I think that that level of detail is necessary. Because otherwise, we can't have a gunfight. We won't know how to adjust for windage. It's like, well, you don't adjust for windage because that's ridiculous. Or if it's so windy that it's really going to do it at a general +1 and keep going on with your life. But I think that I have to know that material, and then when I'm reading something, obviously Hans Christian is like God's gift to guns from Germany, so anything he says about guns is going to be worth reading just on its own, whether there's GURPS rules to it or not. So there's sort of 2 or 3 reasons to read something like that. And then, a lot of them are just, pretty fun reads. I mean, a lot of them are, everything Sean writes is certainly really well written and interesting and clever. And so I just like reading Sean's prose. I'm not sure I want to read any papers he published as a physicist, but I'm pretty sure I want to read everything he writes for how to shoot people in the face.
That is one of the nice things that he's done. And in the interview with him, he talks about it very deliberately, which is, he's done, although, I wrote a very technical grappling book, and we've got tactical shooting, and there's all kinds of crunch that exists, he writes a lot of stuff that serves story. And for a game that gets a bad rap for the core simulation, he's really tried to build up look, you can just tell fun, freewheeling stories at any point level using this system. I don't think people give it a lot of credibility.
And
but
I certainly have. True. I mean, every time I've run GURPS, I've run it, and I love running GURPS. I think GURPS is great. And every time I've run it, I run it at exactly the level of detail that I want, and I deliberately ignore all the detail that I don't. And if it's something that you have to do, like vehicle building, I usually have a friend who's a bigger nerd than me who's in the game, and I say, you are the lucky winner of get to build the spaceship, so off with you, go build it, and come back and show it to me.
That's actually one of the things that I enjoyed very much. It surprised me how much I enjoyed it, but again, as I got older and I got less time, there's a surprising amount of fun out of David's spaceships. Pick 20 segments of mass, just pick them and get on with it.
I mean, that's the old Traveler way, right? It was bulk units or whatever they called it back in the day.
Okay, I played a very limited game of Traveler, and honestly, I think we never played because I think that was actually my character died in creation, and then my friend and I went and played a video game. Yep. Or so, on our Atari 2600 or whatever it was. Maybe he had a Commodore 64 at the time.
Yeah, spaceships is like the next logical iteration of after the vehicle construction stuff in GURPS World War II that was kind of like that, but since it was constrained to follow some sort of real-world performance, there was still more jiggly-pokely, best if you do it in a spreadsheet than I like in my vehicle construction rules.
Yeah, and that's actually the whole...
I don't like them.
Right, no, and that's actually gotten me in a little bit of trouble in that I almost always design, when I think about rules, I pull up Excel. If I'm going to read a book, I pull up Excel. If I'm going to drink a nutrition shake, I pull up Excel because I just need it. But that's one of the things that occasionally gets me in trouble is that I have this mathematical stuff, and I'm like, okay, and if I do it this way, it actually works out and scales right. And then I put that into text. This actually happened to me in technical grappling, where I was like, oh, and if you do this and you just round normally, it's all good. And then Peter, unfortunately, far too late, is like, why didn't you just do it by fives? I'm like, oh, hell, yeah. If I would have had this round from you get to 15 and you're changed, and then you get to 19 and you're still the same, then you get to 20 and you're changed, you can just wing it and go. Whereas the way that technically I've done it in the text, like the bracket around 15 goes from 13 to 17 or something like that, and that's just mean to a game master or a player for that matter. Last piece, and then I'll sort of give you the last word and go. I did note in Night's Black Agents there's a whole box text about grappling. And it tied into something that I thought was fun, which was, and obviously I'm biased, the TV tropes section on grappling is most grappling rules suck because grappling is really hard to do and it's different than other combat. And I actually riffed off that in my designer's notes and said, it's really not. But I wanted to offer up, and for future, I was thinking about this, how would I do grappling in Night's Black Agents? And I think what I would do is some kind of attack where if you succeed, you temporarily lower the other guy's athletics pool, since that's kind of a proxy for strength and dex.
Yeah, but if you're lowering their athletics pool, it has almost no impact on the actual course of the game or the course of the fight because you're not spending from athletics.
You'd have to. You're right. You'd have to lower hand-to-hand and/or athletics.
Right.
Right. So strength, dex, and okay, that would make more sense. You're right.
Yeah, and so you're either lowering, like you say, hand-to-hand and athletics, or you're lowering hand-to-hand and hit threshold or something like that. And I suppose you could do that if you wanted there to be a special. Let's turn this around on its head.
Sure.
Let's say I was doing a gumshoe game based on Gerard Kirsch's phenomenal book Night and the City, which is about the wrestling scene in sordid post-war London. You'd want to have more of a differential between grappling and other kinds of fighting, because there's going to be a lot more wrestlers involved in your game, right?
Sure.
Or maybe a gumshoe lucha book. Then that sort of differentiation might become important, because you'd have sort of 3 stages of a fight, right? In a normal role-playing fight, or in a normal gumshoe fight at least, there's either you can still fight or you're out of the fight, right? And the health clock is actually, it's not a measure of how many liters of blood are left in your body or whatever. It's a clock of how long can you stay in the fight.
Right.
And so being grappled moves you towards getting out of the fight.
Sure.
And that's why I say in the grappling box that you are nice enough to call out, it's the same as everything else. An arm lock is the same as punching someone in the head. Both have just the same chance of taking someone out of a fight. If you're really good at either, you'll do it, right?
Yeah. The whole point, to your point, if I'm trying to restrain you, I win when you can no longer fight back. You're not unconscious, and your health pool may refresh as soon as I let you go.
Mm-hmm.
And that just becomes a dramatic device where you say, I'm grappling this guy, but as I'm not damaging him, not breaking his limbs, I'm literally tying him up until he can't resist, so I can capture him and later interrogate him or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens is you say, okay, fine, you get to negative thing, and he's out of the fight, you've got him pinned or helpless or whatever, he taps and gives, and then you let go, and his health pool instantly refreshes, or his whatever pool instantly refreshes, because you've let him go, and he could run away, but he's morally beaten, and so he's not going to.
Right.
And you know, and as you say this stuff, you're like, look, and the same thing is, I was looking at this, and the same deal was, I'm like, so getting hit by a 50 BMG, which is 13,000 joules, is really only 1 point better than getting hit by a 9mm pistol, and the guy who wrote the old article in 2004 about converting real-world stats to GURPS ballistics and all that stuff cringes a little bit, but then I'm like, the important part is, are you still in the fight? And, you know, if you're doing fisticuffs with someone and you roll 1d6 for damage and it's -1 or whatever it is for maybe it's -2 for fists, the damage potential of poking someone in the nose and shooting them with a 50 BMG overlaps. Nobody cares.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody cares. And if you care, then what you need to do is find the cool narrative thing that makes it cool rather than pink mist.
Yeah.
That's not the point of,
I mean,
of the system.
if your goal in the game, and if everyone is agreed that you should have a anti-material rifle that is an instant kill if you hit, that's easily enough done in Gumshoe. You say, instead of roll health, it's like you're instantly killed.
Right.
Fine. But the trouble is, most players are smart enough to know we don't have the only anti-materiel rifle in the world. In fact, if you run the numbers, almost all anti-materiel rifles are in other hands. We don't want there to be an instant kill device in the game. That takes us out of having fun, and it never happens to Jason Bourne, more importantly, that as he's parkouring around Paris, there's a guy a quarter of a mile away with an anti-materiel rifle who's like, okay, whatever, boom, he's knocked off the ridgeline and he's dead. That never happens. I mean, you know, there's those compilations of clips on YouTube where it's like the number of places that a cell phone wrecks the story. Well, you could do a much longer list of places that a sniper wrecks the story.
Right.
Right? I mean,
absolutely. Right.
Actually, bulletproof heroes in popular fiction is not that high, and the number of competent snipers in the real world is really very high. So, you know, I don't think that saying one is unrealistic and one is not unrealistic really serves anything, because there aren't going to be snipers killing you from a mile away in a normal game that is attempting to emulate thrillers any more than there are snipers a mile away killing Jason Bourne.
And you bring up a great point, which is, you know, why you're a pro at this and I'm interviewing you. But you bring up a great point, which is the reciprocity of it. If you want something where you can reach out for 1,500 meters and instantly touch somebody and they're gone, that's great. And you know what? That works on mooks. But the reciprocity of it, if you can reach out 1,500 meters and do that, someone can do it to you. And it's the old rocks fall, everybody dies, or even worse, rocks fall and this one guy dies and he gets to go for pizza or beer because he's done for the day.
Yeah.
Not conducive to a social environment where you're getting together with friends.
And not conducive to story, because what you want is for a story to happen. You want players to take an active hand and to move forward into the world. And if they have the perfectly rational exception that if we set foot outside of our bunker, someone will shoot us in the head from 1,500 meters, they aren't going to move outside the bunker. They'll say, nope, we're going to sit in our bunker and we're going to order in pizza and we're never going to leave. And we don't care how many vampires there are out there because we're going to get a lot of garlic on the pizza, and so we will be safe.
Right. And right. The place... Right, and the places like in George R.R. Martin's books where that is sort of the trope is subverted. You're going through one of the books, or almost all of the books, but I'm reading it. I haven't read the whole thing because I was still in the middle of A Wheel of Time when he was, and I was like, I can't do this to myself twice. So my wife has read all of them, but I was reading the first one, The Game of Thrones, and I'm getting to the thing. I'm like, oh yeah, this Ed Stark guy. Is a great character and blah blah blah. What? I didn't see that one coming. Where's the hero? Where's the whatever? It's okay. Ow. Interesting, and he does it over and over again. But the only time you can do that is when, effectively, as a writer, you have an ensemble cast of 100, and it doesn't matter. Especially then, I guess what happens is, you get to see these guys again anyway. But unless you've got a list of characters that you can just pick off, and you're like, yeah, you stepped outside and you walked into the vampire's thing, and his throat was torn out, and I hope that your platoon mate can replace him. Mm-hmm. It doesn't. It makes a good story, but it has to be done well, and it has to be. You have to have the backup character.
I mean, you can certainly make a bloody kill fest out of Night's Black Agents, but it should be a fun bloody kill fest.
Correct.
Having your throat torn out by a vampire is way sexier than being shot by a sniper you never heard of, much less saw.
Fair enough.
And so, in my playtest, we had pre-gen characters that were Serbian thugs, basically the Serbian mafia. And we ran a fight between those guys and one vampire to demonstrate to my players what one vampire could do. And, of course, he wiped the floor with them. And in the fiction, this was something that was happening on a closed-circuit camera because my players had, their player characters had previously bugged that Venetian palazzo because they wanted to see what was happening in it. So they get to watch as their pre-gens are torn to pieces by a vampire. And they're like, oh, okay, that's very serious and very big. But it's different because they know that the whole game now is find out when vampires are near, find out how we can kill them first, find out how we can be the guy 1,500 meters away, because you've established a unimaginable horror, but the game is to constrain it now. Whereas being shot in the head, we know what that is. I mean, we live in Chicago. We hear people get shot in the head all the time who never even did anything.
Right.
But it's a different kind of a story if the bad guys just hired a sniper, and that's not fun. That's not interesting, and it doesn't reward play. So.
Right. Okay. One quick question. I had a direct. So, does suppressed transmission exist in any form right now? Do you fire that kind of thing off anymore, or that's not where your energies are channeled these days?
The closest thing to a suppressed transmission that's happening now is Ken Writes About Stuff, which is my monthly thing from Pelgrane Press. It's about twice as long or 3 times as long as a suppressed transmission. Half of the Ken Writes About Stuff every other month is a examination of a Lovecraftian creature from all possible angles. So there's a deep ones, ghouls, hounds of Tindalos, shoggoths, and I think I'm missing one, Mygo, that have been done so far. I'll be doing Star Vampires next. And so that is half of it. The other half is either gumshoe sort of rules examinations, where I take a topic and I try and provide to help your little GURPS heart there, Douglas. It's a generic look at the rule situation. So I've done a gumshoe zoom on martial arts for a general way to put martial arts into any gumshoe game, and then mind control to put mind control into any gumshoe game.
I'll have to admit, I saw the something about. I saw the note about the gumshoe martial arts, and I will admit I haven't read it, but I was fascinated by it because at the time I just had a minimal amount of experience with Trail of Cthulhu, and I'm like, I have no idea how you do martial arts with a system, a detailed martial arts system, or maybe that was it. The kind of detail that I was used to, or GURPS martial arts, or whatever.
Yeah.
Boy, how or even why would you reflect that in a system like Gumshoe?
And you would do it because you're doing it in a story space that is a martial arts story. So either you're doing the kind like the Bourne stories where the Eskrima fight is a real important part of the movie, and so you want to reflect that, and so you want Eskrima to feel different than a standard beatdown, or you're doing a martial arts game, so maybe you're doing it in one of those wuxia stories where everyone is a Shaolin kung fu master wandering around, or you're doing it in a in Trail of Cthulhu if your characters have gone to Japan or China, and suddenly there's martial arts is now part of the universe. Basically, it's anytime you want to tell a martial arts story as well as whatever other story you're telling, you can bring that out. It doesn't add a lot more complexity. It adds a little bit more, obviously, but it's not GURPS martial arts, even though I went to GURPS martial arts and mined it heavily, like I did Ninja Hero and mined that heavily for it. But it's not that complex. But it's an attempt to help everyone bring martial arts flavor into a gumshoe fight if they want to do that. It basically gives you free refreshes for saying awesome martial arts things at its most basic. And that's really the core, because what people want to do is not calculate how many action points they have left and can I get in a jumping kick. No, you want to be able to say, I do a jumping kick and kick that guy in the head, and that's what that rewards. So, yeah, that's the Gumshoe Martial Arts Zoom right there. There's also sort of suppressed transmission style looks at Die Glocke, the Bell project, the Nazi Bell, which is the anti-Grail myth of the 21st century. And a campaign frame, Moondust Men, where you're playing UFO investigators in the 1970s, attached to the Air Force's top secret Project Moondust. And yeah, so it's that kind of and look at the city of Mumbai, which is not really a not really a suppressed transmission thing, but it is sort of a broader look at something as opposed to a narrowcast thing. So yeah, I think the closest thing you can get right now to suppressed transmission is Ken writes about stuff from Pelgrane, and that will maybe get a little more suppressed transmission-y, or it may stay about as suppressed transmission-y as it is now, but that's where you get it.
Okay, excellent. As always, I like to give my guests the last word. So first, a preemptive thank you, and then I'll do it again after you're done. Do you have anything you'd like to add or say, or what's coming next, or what you like, or where the industry needs to go, or wax lyrical about stuff?
Well, I mean, waxing lyrical, as people can tell, is sort of my default state. I don't know. I've plugged Ken Writes About Stuff, which is what I kind of wanted to plug. I'll mention that I'm still writing stuff for Pelgrane, so if you want to follow me, most of my stuff is coming out from Pelgrane, and you should keep an eye on those games and take a look at any of the Pelgrane games that pique your interest, and hopefully I've written something that will feed that. I'll be a guest of honor at the H.P. Lovecraft Film Festival and CthulhuCon in Portland, Oregon in April. And if you're watching this before then, you might want to go to their Kickstarter and throw them a couple of bucks. There's all kinds of hoodies and commemorative tchotchkes and stuff you can get if you're not in Portland, or you can pay to make your Portland experience a better one if you plan to go. So that's a worthy cause. Let's see what else is associated with me. I've written my 4th mini Mythos book for Atlas Games, and that should be coming out not super soon, but probably this year. So if you enjoyed Where the Deep Ones Are and Antarctic Express and Clifford the Big Red God, then Goodnight Azathoth is on its way.
Sorry, I have a 4-year-old.
Yeah. Well, an ideal book for your 4-year-old, certainly. And
well, I do have what is it? I'm blanking. There's a zombie book it's like the mommy has festering eyes. Do you have festering eyes? It's a great little parody of the classic, and I've got it on my desk at work because I don't have it here. But yeah, so
yeah. So the 4th in my series of Lovecraftian children's books is coming out from Atlas Games fairly soon. Let's see. I can't immediately think of anything else that I can super easily plug. You already plugged Madness Dossier quite nicely, and Keylong, my uh, OSR Trad Fantasy sandbox from Lamentations of the Flame Princess. If you're an OSR player or Lamentations of the Flame Princess player, then that's something for you. If you've ever dreamed of recreating Valhalla Rising in a fantasy analog of Cambodia, well, this is your chance to do that. Let's see, what else? Where the industry needs to go, it needs to go, faster where it's going already, which is to say to distributed distribution, so that you get as close to individual creators connecting with customers, and you start cutting distributors out of it. I think a good retail store is absolutely part of that connection, though, because they make customers that you didn't know you had yet. So a game store like Endgame or The Source or a really top-end game store is always going to be part of the mix, and any creator worth their salt is going to try and keep them in the mix as much as possible. I think that it would be nice if the new D&D brought more people into the game stores to buy stuff, and we'll just have to hope that Mike has done a good job with that. But I think that the faster that we can get to the place that all the rest of media is going, then the happier we'll be when we get there, because that's going to be the only stable ground, I think, for the foreseeable future.
That could easily kick off to another hour of conversation about the fusion of tabletop gaming and computers.
Well, that's a whole different question.
It is an entirely different question. Gaming aids, whether it's virtual tabletop to sort of replace the face-to-face group or supplement it. I can't have a face-to-face group. I want one, but I can't. So right now, it's easy for me to come home, do my work stuff, and do gaming, and so the virtual tabletop replaces that. But there's all kinds of great things where you could take advantage of the medium, but that's an entirely different conversation. We won't go there. We've been talking for a generous 2 hours of your time, for which I would like to thank you.
Although if you're interested in tabletop and computer interface, you can also go to Storyscape, the Kickstarter that my buddy Robin Laws is doing for Slabtown Games, which is a tablet-based game that will have all of the fiddly math in the tablet, so no one has to remember it, not even a GURPS player, and will make it possible eventually to build out a broadly a universal game experience from tablet play, and their Kickstarter could use some love, and maybe you could do an interview with Robin, maybe not a 2-hour video interview, but maybe something that gets Robin to talk about Storyscape, because I know he's really excited about that, and anything that comes out from Robin will be pretty terrific. That might be something.
I would be happy to do so, actually. It's one of these things where it's funny, because on the one hand, I know that creators love to talk about their stuff, as well they should. And for me, as someone who is somewhat new to the blogging thing, I've been doing it for a year, but also it's just like, gee, is Ken Hite going to spend an hour of his time, or 2 in this case, which was awesome, with some random guy just talking about stuff? And what I found is that, yes, they will.
Well, you're not some random guy. You're, like you say, I recognize your name from GURPS contributing and tactical wrestling and the rest of that. So it wasn't completely average, but on the other hand, that's what I'm here for, and part of that future of direct connection between creator and audience is to, let people see the creator and, hear what they have to say, and that's where, that's where I thank you for bringing me on and giving me, giving me a place where I can talk for 2 hours uninterrupted to your readers, and that's that's part of the fun as well. While I'm plugging people's Kickstarters, not yet, but in the very near future, the Swedish game magazine Phoenix, where I write a column every 2 months, and I guess that's the other place you could see a suppressed transmission thing from me, is that every 2 months I do a column for Phoenix, which is quite often a full setting, so it's 4,000 words of a setting, and that has a sort of a suppressed transmission-y feel to it, although there are fewer darling quotes, because I didn't want to keep reinventing that particular wheel. But there's still some. But they are doing a Indiegogo to do a Best of Phoenix magazine in English. My stuff is already in English, but they'll be translating a lot of the other great Phoenix content, and that's Fenix magazine from Sweden, and they do a They do a great job. It's one of the best general gaming magazines around. It's just in a language that only 9 million people can read. So they're trying to expand their remit a little bit. So if you're looking at this in February, the Indiegogo campaign is probably up and running, and you can go look for that. Or if you are a Swede or someone who reads Swedish, or someone who just thinks that 4,000 words of my prose is worth subscribing to a whole magazine you can't read, and you live in Europe, then I recommend Phoenix. I think it's a terrific magazine, and the people who run it, Tove and Anders, are really great people and total alpha gamers in Sweden.
Excellent. So again, I want to thank you for your time, and I guess that wraps up a really fun 2 hours.